Another important part about landscape design is to create good eye movement using focal points and lines. When we first enter or look at a landscape, our human eyes need a place to start, and that's the focal point. If there's nothing that stands out as a focal point, our eyes search around and around and around, and that's a bit unsettling and uninviting. Something needs to stand out to get us started. What makes something stand out can vary. Focal points can be pretty much anything that stands out from what's around it. So in this case, most people agree that the ornamental grasses are the focal point. They're the first thing that your eye locks on. The reason they stand out is not because they're a bright color, but because of their form. They're the only plants in the foreground that have an upright structure. All the other plants, the mounted evergreen on the right, the boulders along the pond, the ground cover in the front, even the dwarf spruce on the left of the grasses, all of those things have a horizontal structure that move your eye left and right. Because the tall grasses have a significant contrast in shape from what's around it, they stand out as a focal point. Remember that anytime something is different than what's around it, it will stand out, and the more contrast there is, the stronger that focal point will be. Lots of different things can be focal points. Anything, whether it's a plant, a piece of garden art, a structure. Keep in mind that bad things can also stand out as focal points, and that likely will not be what you want. A dead or dying plant, for example, will be different than what's around it, hopefully, and that's what's going to make it stand out. In landscaping, what gets challenging is that focal points often change throughout the seasons, and you have to plan for that. When a plant is in bloom, it may scream to be looked at, but once the blooms are gone, the plant fades back into the landscape and something else has to take over as the focal point. You really have to pay attention to bloom times as well as what other ornamental features of each plant, such as leaf color or twig shape, are also going to stand out. You don't want a landscape that's too busy with too many focal points in one season and bland and boring in another. So how many focal points should you have? Well, in any given viewpoint, you should only have one major focal point and maybe one or two secondary focal points that your eye finds after it starts moving through the landscape. This gets really challenging because you have to break the landscape into expected major viewpoints. Landscaping gets viewed from all kinds of directions, but you kind of have to decide where the major viewpoints are going to be and design for those. So for example, if you walk out the back door of a house and look straight into the back of the yard, that will be one viewpoint. Your peripheral vision will have you seeing a little to the left and the right, but the main viewpoint is the back lot line of the property. In that area, you should have one major focal point, and then groups and masses of plants should draw your eye back and forth. You may stop on one or two secondary focal points along the way that are smaller or less demanding for attention. If you turn to your left, you will now see the left property line, and you won't really see the back lot line except slightly out of your peripheral vision. So you have to have another main focal point along the left property line because it's a whole separate viewpoint. And then you can also have one or two secondary focal points on that side. Now obviously if you look to the back left corner of the property, you might be able to see the focal points on both the back lot line as well as the left lot line. But what you as a designer have to do is to decide what are the major viewpoints, what would naturally be the major viewpoints, or what are the viewpoints you want to create, and break it down that way and locate focal points accordingly. Try to keep focal points from different major viewpoints far enough apart so that they don't fight with each other, and have low energy gradual sequence spaces in between to move the eye where you want it between those viewpoints, perhaps directing it towards those secondary focal points, but again you can't have too much going on in any one view. Also, the focal point should not be put right in the middle of the viewpoint. Research shows that our human brains prefer it to be 1/3 of the way from either side. Actually, it's called the golden section. It's exactly 8/13 of the way, but we can round that to 1/3. So when in doubt, divide things into thirds, not halves, and place the focal point 1/2 of the way from either side, not right in the middle. Here's a plant collection, a very busy planting bed with far too many plants in it. So what does your eye do? What's the focal point? For some, it's maybe that red plant on the left. Others see that bright spot in the middle, but usually there's a lot of disagreement because nothing is really standing out. And what's worse is once your eye finally does decide on a place to start, what does it do? It mostly circles around and around and around a few times looking for something to grab it, and it finally clicks on that row of begonias along the edge and follows that line right out of the picture. If you don't create an obvious focal point, the viewer will make one up, and the eye will go somewhere you didn't intend it to go. If there's not an obvious focal point, it'll look for a line. So this is an example of a planting bed that has way too much variety and not enough simplicity. You can make focal points stronger by directing the eye to them. On the left, the bench is the focal point and it's framed by two clumps of feather reedgrass, which make it stand out even more. On the right, the focal point is most likely the upright variegated iris, but you can make an argument that the dark red-leafed coral bell is the focal point. In this case, the strong contrast in color between the two plants is probably what makes the pairing stand out. If the bright yellow ground cover wasn't there, then the yellow in the iris would stand out even more because there would be more contrast. So here's an example of where each of those plants has its own strong features to call attention to it, but they aren't able to show off because they're planted next to each other. If this plant combination was surrounded by green, the whole grouping could serve as a focal point because the whole grouping as a whole would stand out. But by itself in this picture, this grouping doesn't have a strong focal point or any eye movement, so it can get a little bit confusing even though they're all great plants. Look around a landscape to see what's already there that might serve as a good focal point. In this picture, the focal point is just an ordinary window on a garage. It's a nice focal point because it's a little unique. It's unique in shape, and because of the rust-colored trim contrasting with the white, it makes a nice frame and that grabs your attention to it. And because of its geometric shape, it's different than all the free-form plants around it, and that also makes it stand out. Even more attention is drawn to the window by the vines that are on the wall on either side of it, so they kind of frame it, and then the flowers in the planter box at the bottom of the window. The window makes a cute little focal point, and at the same time, if there's something like this already there acting as a focal point, you have to be careful you don't put in another strong focal point that would fight with it, whether it's a colorful plant or a sculpture or something. You need to look at what's already there, what's going to naturally be a focal point. If you don't want that thing to be a focal point, you have to figure out a way to get around that. But this could dilute the effectiveness of both things if you had a window like this and another focal point that you added. One of the major challenges in landscape design is that plants change throughout the season and you have to plan for that. Different plants will have different interests throughout the year. Lilacs, for example, when they're in bloom, demand a lot of attention. But once the flowers are gone, they're plain, green, nondescript shrubs. So the plant as a whole may be a focal point at one time during the season, and later something else has to become the focal point. However, there are some plants that are focal points all year long, or at least for the majority of the growing season. Annuals are one of those because we choose them for their bright blooms or foliage. In these pictures here, the Love Lies Bleeding Amaranth on the right can't help but be a focal point when blooming just by the nature of those long, deep red stringy blooms. The flowering kale in the middle is usually pretty green all summer, but when the cooler weather starts in the late summer and fall, the colors come out and they become more of a focal point. So what do you see as the focal point in this planting? It's apparently a collection of dwarf evergreens, and there are at least 8 or 10 different specimens in there. But because each one is different from what's around it, and all by itself, each one of them is a focal point. There are also 2 other things that look like a bird bath and a sundial that are also acting as focal points in this relatively small area. So here's a case of way too many focal points for this space. Your eye doesn't know where to start nor where to go, so it circles around and around a few times, and then it's likely to grab onto that white pipe that comes down the corner of the garage. That's not what you want from a design standpoint. Too many focal points, no matter how fabulous each plant or each thing is by itself, makes for too busy of a landscape. Here's another landscape with lots and lots of focal points. You can see that the landscape is very neat and well maintained, but when you look at it, it's very disjointed in that the eye doesn't know where to start nor where to go. You can see that around the base of each tree there's a ring of flowers. Flowers are pretty, but the bright color draws your attention there. The base of a tree is probably not where we want to draw attention. Every one of those spots takes away from the other elements of the landscape, like the fountain or the other planting bed that's in there. We also don't have the outdoor room concept in this landscape. There's no central area, and instead elements are just scattered around without any real design. It's too busy so your eye doesn't move peacefully through the landscape with any kind of order or relaxation. Remember that in any given viewpoint you should have one major focal point and maybe one or two secondary focal points. In this landscape there are probably at least 10 different things acting as focal points, with no one of them really standing out. So again, your eye gets lost, it doesn't really know where to go, and so it's just not as nice of a landscape as it could be. Once our eyes get caught on a focal point, we need somewhere to go, so our eyes will naturally look for lines to follow. Lines will create movement through the landscape so that you see all of the other supporting components. Our goal is to move the eye peacefully back and forth through the landscape. Many different things can create lines, including bed lines, paths, hardscapes, and groups and masses of plantings. And I'm not talking about straight lines or about plants planted in rows. The lines can be curved or formed by masses or many other things. In this picture, your eye probably started in the bottom on that dark spot of visible soil, because that's what stands out among the green because of the contrast. Then it goes up along the left, along that bed line there. Our eyes again will naturally lock onto a line and follow it. So we need to be very aware of what kinds of lines are in the landscape, both created and accidental. Here's a strong line created by a mass of bright petunias along the path. The petunias aren't planted in a row, it's actually a long mass of petunias, but when we see them from a distance, it looks like a line. To a bird flying over, it's a blob. The mass of petunias forming the line draws attention to the path and tells a visitor that the path is here. Go ahead and walk down it. Where the eye goes, the feet will follow if it's accessible. So using lines can not only help visually move the eyes through the landscape, but it can help direct people through the landscape. Here's a planting with a couple of different lines going on. The flowering kale has some lines in it that make your eyes move around, but the stronger, brighter color of the straight line of yellow marigolds eventually grabs your eye even more, and your eye follows that line off to the top. You can tell this picture was taken in the fall because the shrubs in the top right are fall color, but also because the flowering kale is likely to be green during the summer, and then it gets the pink and purple later on in the year. When the kale is green, that line of marigolds would be even more powerful. But you can see how your eye wants to find lines within that kale and move around. Those lines don't necessarily go anywhere, so it's a little unsettling, but your eye is looking for lines. Notice the eye movement in this picture created by the bed lines. The bright colors of the annual plantings are definitely the focal point. Then the bed lines take your eye up to the patio and sitting area. Lines like this can be used to draw attention to something important in the landscape that might otherwise not be real visible or stand out on its own. On the other hand, you want to be sure that you don't have lines take the eye into something that you don't want to draw attention to, such as utility boxes, garbage cans, a firewood pile, or something else that's not visually all that great. What does your eye do here? It likely started on the canopy of the tree and then followed the arching branch down towards the water. This is an example of how a plant's form or shape can create lines and eye movement in the landscape. You can use this to your advantage to point the eye where you want it to go. On the other hand, you have to be careful with plants that have a strong form to them, such as columnar or pyramidal evergreens. While we commonly see those types of plants on the corners of houses, that's really not good design because they point the eye up to the shingles of the roof or to the sky rather than keeping it in the landscape where we want it. Within a bed, you need some kind of lines as well. You might have a bed that's part of an overall landscape that's viewed from a distance, and there are lines throughout the landscape moving the eye around. From a distance, the viewpoint covers more area and a bigger part of the landscape. But if you walk up to the bed, your viewpoint gets smaller. It covers less area as you look at things close up. So when you're looking at a bed closer up, you also need to have good eye movement within that bed. The left-hand picture shows that there are some lines in the bed created by the groups and masses of the plants that move your eye back and forth. The picture on the right, however, is pretty much a hodgepodge of plants, so your eye goes around and around looking for a focal point and a line to follow. That's why lots of individual plants within a bed, planted one here, one there, one of these, one of those, is not as attractive as when you plant in groups and masses. Even though this is a relatively small bed, there's some good eye movement going on, created mainly by using groups and masses and not individual plants. Your eye may start on the grasses, but there are two potential lines to follow: the pink flowers along the edge of the bed, or the line created by the boulder and the mound of spiky plants in front of the grass that takes your eye left and right. And here are a couple more pictures of planting beds with groups and masses of plants that cause lines to move the eye peacefully back and forth. Notice too that the beds need to be wide enough to be able to plant in interlocked groups and masses and not just straight rows of plants. That goes back to having beds that are in scale for the landscape and avoiding narrow, small beds. Notice the eye movement in this picture. The plantings along the front move your eye back and forth and lead it to the archway structure on the far left, which is actually the entrance to the walk that leads to the staircase to this old house. This is an example of how using lines can direct people to where you want them to go, especially if it's otherwise not very obvious. It's very important to consider what creates lines in a landscape, because our human eyes will look for them and follow them. You want to make sure you're aware of existing lines and either break them if they're taking the eye where you don't want it to go, or at least soften them. You also want to make sure that you're creating some good eye movement, even if it's just subtle lines, to move the eye pleasingly through the landscape. Again, back and forth horizontally in most cases. The eye can go up a little bit and then come back down, but we want to make sure it stays in the landscape. So we can use lines and sequence or contrast to draw attention to things that we want to draw attention to and away from things that we don't want real visible in the landscape. So where do you want to draw attention? We usually want to draw attention to entryways, whether it's an entry to the house or a building or a pathway or some other area. We also want to draw attention to good features, especially if they're not real visible on their own. Maybe a small sculpture or a small piece of garden art or a pond that's not real visible on its own. And we also want to draw attention away from bad things, such as utility boxes. So for example, if there's a mountain view in the distance or a special plant, you can use lines to draw attention to things that may not be real visible on their own. Looking at this landscape, which most people find appealing, you can see how your eye moves around, following lines that are created by bed lines, the retaining walls, and the masses of plants. This landscape pulls things together. It has balance, it's in scale, it has repetition, it has good sequence, it has variety, but it's not too busy, and it just pulls all of the principles of design as well as good eye movement together.